Thank you, Madam Speaker, and merci à mes collègues. I'll start by saying I want to recognize, as my friend from Spanish Gulf Island did, on the point of relevance, that I'll be focusing my speech on the fall economic statement as opposed to what we really should be doing, which is focusing on this amendment if we were to follow exactly the orders of the day. I recognize it's been about 3 months of talking about this particular motion. In fact, as you know, I've shared a few times how we've had a number of speakers on this. The number of Conservative speakers alone are 223 or so. And so I have spoken quite a bit to this motion already to make clear Greens supported back in June the support of the precedent to this motion. That continues to be the case. My second apology is things have been so last minute and kind of disjointed today. I would usually even send notes for a speech like this to translators. Apologies to them. I haven't actually done that tonight either. But I do think it's important to take every opportunity I can to speak out for the concerns and the priorities of folks in my community, and this is an important moment to do so. Because, of course, like many in this place and across the country, I'm troubled by the events of today, but more so I'm troubled by the statement that we were provided with just this afternoon, the fall economic statement. Because the reality is that folks in my community are in a time of crisis. We look at it's 40% of those living in poverty are folks with disabilities. That should not be the case in a country as wealthy as ours. In my community, I've spoken quite a bit about the number of people who are living unsheltered at a time when rents have doubled in my community in recent years. The number of people living unsheltered tripled from 2018 to 2021, from just over 300 to over 1,000. And with the most recent point-of-count study, nearly tripled again to over 2,300. Meanwhile, we continue to be the only country in the G7 whose emissions have risen since 1990. We are in a closing window of opportunity to act on the climate crisis. It's because of these significant crises that are facing folks in my community and those across the country that Greens proposed a number of constructive solutions that could have been in the fall economic statement. I'll go over a few of those now with the time I have here. We could first of all start with fixing the Canada Disability Benefit and following through on the promise this government made to folks with disabilities to lift hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities out of poverty. This was another moment missed for this government to follow through on doing so. Also, of course, this is a moment where they could have addressed the housing crisis that we are in. Greens have been calling for this government to get towards a plan to double social housing across the country. If they did so, we'd go from the bottom to just the middle of the pack in the G7. One of the ways we've proposed they do so is in a new motion I've put forward to require CMHC to have 2 income-based definitions of affordable housing to ensure when they talk about funds like the Affordable Housing Fund that money is actually going to build affordable housing that would support people who are in core housing need, relying on the research by housing experts like Dr. Carolyn Weitzman and others across the country. We've been calling on them to address the loopholes for large corporate landlords who are buying up housing in my community, raising rents, and profiteering off of our homes. With those funds, we could then turn and address a gap in HST that was exempted for for-profit developers of rental housing to ensure that nonprofit builders of affordable home ownership, like Habitat for Humanity, they could have been HST exempt, and we can pay for it, as I mentioned, by taxing real estate investment trusts like other corporations, for example. These are the kinds of housing solutions we'd put forward to be in the fall economic statement. We'd also had been calling for this government to get serious about funds to support harm reduction and other programs to support people who are using drugs who are dying from poisoned drugs. In my community, I haven't looked at the numbers today, it was at least 72 people when I last checked had died in Waterloo Region from poison drugs. And there is a federal funding mechanism called the Substance Use and Addictions Program. Greens had been calling for that program to be better funded so that communities like Waterloo Region would get their fair share of funding. To date, we've received $0 in Waterloo Region from this really critical program to support organizations like Sanguine and Community Health Caring to provide supports that keep people alive, because while treatment is important, a person who's dead can't get to treatment. We need to provide a suite of supports that include mental health and housing and treatment and harm reduction along with safe supply. That's part of what Greens had been calling for. Of course, Greens had also been talking about revenue tools to fund solutions. One of those revenue tools is a windfall profit tax. Because while there's a lot of talk in this place about the carbon tax going up 2 cents a litre in 2022 and in years since, in 2022, the profits of the oil and gas industry went from some 26 cents a litre to around 44 or so, an increase of 18 cents a litre, all of which went to their profits, ended up around, I think 66 billion or so for the top 5 oil and gas companies operating in Canada. It's clear those companies are gouging Canadians while their emissions go up. They are responsible for the largest share of emissions while we're in a climate crisis. This government has put in place a windfall profit tax. They called it the Canada Recovery Dividend. They applied it on banks and life insurance companies in the midst of the pandemic. As Greens, all we've been saying is now do oil and gas. I put forward a motion to propose doing so. The PBO has costed it. With a windfall profit tax on profits above $1 billion, even just a 15% tax on profits above $1 billion, this government could generate $4.2 billion a year. Those are the funds that could be used to invest in public transit, for example, rather than seeing local councils like the region of Waterloo talking about cutting public transit routes or increasing fares. The federal government could be showing up with the dollars to help them make sure that high school students, for example, could get lower or no fares. We could also see the federal government step up for the permanent public transit fund to be put in place sooner than 2026, after the next election, to provide not only infrastructure, but also maintenance, money for mechanics, for example. This is what we'd called for, that windfall profit tax could be used for, along with retrofit funding to help Canadians who want to look at installing retrofits in their homes that would reduce their emissions and save them money. That program had expired February of this year. We'd put forward for them to renew that program in a significant way, to look at $50,000 for Canadians who want to look at retrofitting their homes. We'd been calling for this government to invest in closing the infrastructure gap. At 6 Nations of the Grand River, for example, it continues to be the case that 70% of those living on reserve don't have access to clean drinking water, and their infrastructure gap is around $1.6 billion. This was an opportunity to close that infrastructure gap. Of course, we've also been calling for more equity in federal arts funding, because in communities like mine and many others across the country, while the Canada Council for the Arts has lost funding since the pandemic, about $140 million lost, communities like mine have continued to be historically underfunded. We get about $3 a person, whereas places like Montreal, Vancouver, Winnipeg average around $18 a person or so. Greens had been calling for this fall economic statement to provide a new mechanism to ensure funding is more equitable across the country, and that those funds would be restored to previous levels. What do we get instead after all these calls had been made? Well, when it comes to home retrofits, rather than actually delivering funds, they talk about interest-free loans. Apparently all the money was gone to the billions they're sending to carbon capture, the tens of billions, so much that I can't even keep track. Environmental Defense has been doing their best to do so. They know it's about 18 billion or so in fossil fuel subsidies. Certainly not always the case that they get loans. But when it comes to Canadians who want to retrofit their homes, I guess loans are going to have to continue to do. On housing, they're actually talking about accelerating more funds into the apartment construction loan program. This is a program that only 3% of funds are actually going to those in core housing need. Again, if they don't actually address the underlying definitions of these funds, accelerating more dollars to them isn't going to help address the housing crisis in a substantial way. And when it comes to the Canada Disability benefit, rather than actually addressing the core issue, they're talking about ensuring it's tax-free, which for many was the assumption would always be the case. What we need is to see this government recognize that for so many across the country, folks are feeling in my community like the promise of what Canada could be is being lost. And they need to step up to restore hope and a sense that we can get back to that sense of what's possible for young Canadians and others across the country.